Hello everyone, I welcome you to this CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And today's lecture is actually a special one where we, through the lecture, are going to commemorate the World Poetry Day, which is on 21st of March. So of course every year this significant day appears, and this time we thought of discussing poetry and bringing alive the essence and the importance of this very important literary form. So today's lecture is titled Reflections on Poetry, Commemorating the World Poetry Day. Now, when we talk about the World Poetry Day, some of you might already be familiar with this important event, but you see, one thing is definitely sure, that this is an occasion to remind ourselves of the significance of poetry in life, right? Now, why is poetry important? Because of course, if an entire day is dedicated to this art form, then there must be something very important about it, and there must be a very a particular significance of it. So you see, when we look at poetry, what is very crucial is that it presents thought and emotion in a condensed form. Right? And the other important element also in poetry is that it involves imaginative flight. Now, when I say it involves imaginative flight, this right at the outset, establishes that why do we need to remember or why do we need to incorporate poetry in our lives? Because when we live our day-to-day lives, doing the usual chores, studying, fulfilling responsibilities, etc. So in the middle of the daily routine then, if one is in touch with poetry which is rich in ideas, poetry which is rich in emotion, right? So it kind of transports us to a different realm, and then becomes a source of education, and also still more a source of delight, right? So when I say it involves imaginative flight, so the poet then lets his or her imagination free and expresses their thoughts, their feelings, their emotion. And in fact, you would notice that how poetry is also one of the foremost forms that people turn to the moment they are overwhelmed, the moment they are full of a certain emotion or certain thought, right? So and I'm sure that a lot of you would have also tried your hand at poetry, right? So it's lyricism, the imaginative flight involved in it, the condensed form in which thought and emotion appears in poetry. All of this makes it a very significant presence, makes it a very significant, I would say, if you can call it that, extension of our day-to-day life, which is not as prosaic. Right? Now, if we talk about, of course, then the World Poetry Day is celebrating this form itself. And now we know that why is it important to incorporate poetry then? Yeah, we not just need to read, but we must also be inspired to write poetry, because whenever we are, when we live or experience life as it comes to us on a daily basis, we go through a lot of emotions. We go through, a lot of sometimes disappointments. Sometimes, we are in a state of ecstasy where we are very, very happy. Sometimes we also feel very inspired with something. So when we capture these thoughts in the form of a verse, this becomes a way also to preserve your experience, right? And what better day then to remind ourselves of the power that poetry has. Yeah. So now, if we look at the particular day, which is World Poetry Day, that is on 21st of March, you see the beginning of this day actually was done by UNESCO. So UNESCO first adopted 21st of March as the World Poetry Day during its 30th General Conference in Paris in 1999. And there was a very particular vision behind this. So it was actually driven by the aim of supporting linguistic diversity through poetic expression. Right now, UNESCO, kind of commemorated or actually dedicated this day to poetry in order to celebrate linguistic diversity. How we all are aware that poems are written in various languages, and as I just now established that it's a way of expressing your thought, it's a way of expressing your emotion. So whatever language that one is comfortable in, one ends up writing in that. Right. So, and in fact, from there, we have poets in different Indian indigenous languages. We have poets, of course, in English. We have poets in various world languages as well. Right. So, to bring alive this thought and this idea, UNESCO dedicated 21st of March for the purpose. Now, if you look at the significance still further of this day, it becomes an occasion then to honor poets, to revive the tradition of poetry recitals, of reading and composing poetry, and also to foster the convergence between poetry and other arts, right? So as we talk about poetry, it's not just kind of restricted to reading poetry. And as we just now discussed, that how you recite poetry, you read, and of course you also compose poetry, right? And we also see that how this form of expression does converge with other art forms as well. Like for instance, you would see when you go to watch a play on stage live. So sometimes you would see a character, in an aside, go into a kind of a poetic thought, and you see the person recite perhaps a short poem, right? So we see that, of course, this is one very small instance, but poetry then does converge with various different arts. And when we talk of this in particular, what comes to mind is Brecht. Now, you see, if you read Bertolt Brecht, who's a German playwright, his plays, you will see that his the dramatic action over there has these poetic interludes. So it is said that the dramatic action is punctuated by different songs. So those songs are what? Nothing but poetry. So we see that how this form of expression then pervades our life and also converges with other art forms as well. Now, it's very important for us to look at the form of poetry and understand that how is it different from the other forms of expressions, right? So now poetry is that form of expression which uses aesthetic and often rhythmic qualities of language to evoke meanings different from the usual literal ones, right? Now, over here, there are three things which are very significant. First is that it is that form which uses aesthetic qualities of language. Second, it also uses the rhythmic qualities of language. And third, for what purpose? To evoke meanings which are different from the literal ones. So what do I mean by aesthetic qualities of language? You see, when I talk about aesthetic qualities, I mean that a poetry involves the use of symbols, use of images, metaphors, different figures of speech, right? Now these devices then actually add to the flavor of the poem, where the language you would notice is not very so to say direct, but instead it teases your imagination. It has a certain kind of indirectness to it. So we see it is very important, if you remember that right at the beginning we also said that in poetry it is thought and emotion in a condensed form. Now when we say that it's in a condensed form, how does the thought and emotion become condensed? This is how, by use of these tools, these figures of speech, symbols, images, and metaphors that convey a lot more than what a literal word would. So that becomes the aesthetic aspect of language, which then is concentrated in poetry. Now, next we said that it also involves the rhythmic qualities of language. Now, when we say rhythmic, of course, you're immediately able to identify the word rhythm. Rhythm has got to do with what? Musicality, right? And we all are aware that, of course, if not all, but a lot of poems have a rhythm to them. There's a sound pattern, there's a meter, there's a rhyme, there's a beat, right? And which then adds this musical quality to poems. Now, of course, we also have poems that are written in free verse. Free verse would mean what? That they do not rhyme, right? But the fact that there is a category that is called as free verse, so which means what? That there is a conventional form which involves this idea of musicality closely associated with poetry, right? And then the third element that we said was that these aesthetic and rhythmic qualities of language are then used to evoke meanings different from the literal ones. So this is the third important aspect, that how, when words are used in a poem, they acquire a different meaning. They acquire a meaning from the context. The poet sometimes, lends meaning to a particular word on the basis of his or her experience. And in fact, I would suggest that when you also try to, compose a verse, you would see that when you are so overcome with thought or emotion, you are so compelled, from within to capture an experience of your life, you would see that you would also start to play with words, right? So, by playing with words, what do we mean by that? Where you use the word not just for its literal meaning, but you also seem to ascribe, you do ascribe, or the poet ascribes a meaning of his or her own in the context of the poem. Right. So these three things then are something which distinguish this form of poetry from other forms, such as the form of the narrative, the form of the drama, right? So that's how we say that poetry is different from maybe a novel or from a play that we might read. Yeah. The next thing that we say while discussing the form or while thinking of the poetic form is that arguably poetry is one of the most ancient forms of expression. In the dated past, treatises on different disciplines were also found in the poetic mode. Right? Now, a lot of times sciences and knowledge of medicine, even philosophy for that matter, it was knowledge about these disciplines came to us in the poetic mode. Now, you might wonder that how philosophy? Now, if you would have read Gita, right? If not, of course, the entire text, but even if you happen to take a look at certain excerpts over there. So Gita, of course, carries philosophical ideas on life, on different aspects of human experience, and we know that Gita is it actually comprises what? Verses. So what do we see? We see that how poetry then becomes a source or a form through which a different discipline, that is philosophy, gets articulated, right? And this has been the practice since ancient times. Now, we also say that early forms of poetry include religious hymns, epic poems, and folk songs. Now, you see, when this form came into being in the earlier times, it appeared in the form of religious hymns or religious songs. So, where people would sing songs in praise of God, in praise of certain religious festivals, in order to celebrate festivals together. So that also then had a rhythmic quality to it. It had a musicality to it, and that then seemed to resemble the early forms of poetry. Likewise, the epic poems, which again were what? Oral in form. They were not written. They were in fact, transferred to various generations in the oral mode, right? And even folk songs carried the experience of an entire community. Now imagine how rich would this form be, that how it carried the experience of an entire community, their dreams, their disappointments, their lessons from their day-to-day life, etc. All that would be condensed in folk songs. So we see that how this form, even in its very, very early stages, was very rich and has been a very essential part of human life. So then, therefore, it is actually befitting that we dedicate a day to this art form and try to remember, recall that why is poetry important to life, right? Now, I was talking about religious hymns as an early form. So if you see Rig Ved and if you see Psalms, right? Now Psalms in the Bible and of course Rig Ved we all are aware of. They both these texts would then have songs or poetry. Psalms in fact were songs that are part of the Bible, and likewise epic poems we all are aware. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana. Of course, closer home in the Indian context. If you look at the Greek context, we have Iliad and Odyssey, right? So these are some of the early forms of poetry that we have. Now, having discussed the significance of World Poetry Day, also having taken a look at what exactly is poetry and how it is distinguished from different from the other forms of expression, the next thing that we come to is a discussion of the three major poetic genres. Right now, what are poetic genres? You see, now we understand that how there's different kinds of poetry that is written, yeah. But when we look closely at English poetry, we see these three genres, or so to say, these three broad categories, one can call it, of poems. The first one is the dramatic, second is the epic or the narrative, and the third is the lyric form. Right now, let's very quickly see that what each of these poetic genres mean. Dramatic poetry is actually drama written in verse to be spoken or sung. Greek tragedy in verse dates back to the 16th century BC, and we also see that it seems to have also had some influence on Sanskrit drama as well, right? Now, English plays were also written during the Restoration period, and these plays then were written, a lot of them, in the verse forms, right? So, so the dramatic poetry then, to understand it still more closely, is comprises a drama which whereby the dialogues that are spoken, they are not spoken in the everyday language, or they are not spoken in a way where how you and I communicate, but instead the dialogues also are a kind of poetry, or the dialogues have a poetic element. And when we say poetic element, we mean what? There is lyricism, they are condensed, there is a rich use of words, of the aesthetic and a rhythmic quality of language. So all these aspects are it is easy to locate them in a drama which is written in verse. And as students of literature, you would have read some of the plays of the Restoration period, and that's when verse drama became popular. Now, if we very quickly take a look at an example of verse drama, John Dryden, who's born in 1631 and was around till 1700. He wrote a verse drama, right? And he actually, there's a play called All for Love that he wrote in 1678, and the prologue of it goes like this. It says, "With croaking notes they bode some dire event, and follow dying poets by the scent," unquote. Now you see, what do we notice over here? we see that how then prologue over here is not, written in a usual language. With croaking notes, they bode some dire event and follow dying poets by the scent. So what do we see? In fact, this is part of the initial lines, which must be perhaps read together. Let's go over it once again. Right from the beginning, the prologue says, "What flocks of critics hover here today, as vultures wait on armies for their prey, all gaping for the carcass of a play. With croaking notes they bode some dire event and follow dying poets by the scent." Unquote. So now this, when I even read it, I'm sure you're able to spot this rhythm that there is to the prologue of the play, and so which immediately establishes what? That it is written in the poetic mode. Now you see, it is talking about, and this prologue is talking about the critics who give their opinion on different art forms. Now, instead of directly describing who critics are, what they do, etc., the John Dryden over here is actually very poetically expressing his view of critics. So he says that what flocks of critics hover here today, as vultures wait on armies for their prey. So he is imagining critics as vultures, right? As if they are just ready to pounce upon an artist the moment he or she finishes composing a work, right? Now again, the fact that Dryden imagines critics as vultures brings to mind what? The imaginative flight, which is very crucial to poetry in that sense, right? And then he says, all gaping for the carcass of a play. Now, carcass of a play, it's like the entire text, which is written by a dramatist, or the play, is rendered into a carcass. Carcass, why? Carcass is what? It's just a collection of bones in that sense, right? So critics, they go so close to the text, they try to analyze it threadbare, they try to make sense of every little thing. So this kind of nitpicking, or this kind of a very close analysis done by the critics is then imagined by Dryden as some kind of as having a parallel in what vultures do, how they prey on the animals and they take away all the flesh, leaving behind the carcass, right? So we see over here then a very important element of the dramatic poetry, right? So where drama is then presented in a verse form, and John Dryden then becomes an important figure when it comes to this kind of writing. Now, the second genre of poetry is the epic poetry. Now, what is that? It's a long verse narrative on a serious subject, told in a formal and elevated style, centered on a heroic or a quasi-divine figure, and on the whole, on this quasi-divine figure or the heroic figure, on his or her action depends the fate of a tribe, a community, or a nation. So this is still another kind of poetry, right? Apart from the dramatic verse, we have epic poetry, which is a long verse narrative. Now you see, in the previous one, we saw that how verse mingles with the dramatic form. In this one, verse mingles with the narrative form. So it's a long verse narrative, which runs into hundreds of pages in that sense, right? And of course, there are these distinct qualities to epic. As I just now also mentioned, that Mahabharata is an epic, Ramayana is an epic, even Homer's Iliad is an epic. So all these are some popular examples that you might have also come across, right? So the subject of such poetry is always serious. The manner of expression is formal and it is elevated. Now, when I say elevated, it means that it uses a very stylized language, right? It is not a language which is spoken in day-to-day life. And also, at the center of such a narrative poem, which is a long one, is a heroic or a quasi-divine figure. And the actions of this figure then, decide the fate of the entire community to which it is associated, right? Of course, we have various examples of epic poetry. I would urge you to read Homer, read Mahabharata, read excerpts from Ramayana, and you will be able to notice these distinct qualities over there. Now, the third form or the third genre of poetry is the lyric, and this is of course one that we all are most familiar with. It is a short poem which is uttered by a single speaker who expresses a state of mind or a process of perception, thought, and feeling. Right now, this is also the most commonly used poetic form. It is of course short. The speaker is singular. And you see that how this poem then actually carries the state of mind, the emotion, the thought of the speaker in the poem. Right now, a lot of times when we say that that we should write poetry whenever we are overwhelmed, so a lot of times most of us do end up writing a lyric. So those short poems that we compose are what? Lyrics. Right, and lyric then, of course, had its heyday. If we particularly talk about the English context, it had it actually was very, very popular during the Romantic period. And one poet that comes to mind, who's also a writer of beautiful lyrics, is Wordsworth. Of course, we have different other poets also who've written the lyric, but Wordsworth, comes particularly to mind the moment we talk about this genre of poetry. Right now, even lyric is further divided into different kinds, and we will go into that in the next segment of the lecture. But for now, very quickly going over all that we have discussed, we talked about what poetry is. We established its three important elements, that how it makes use of the aesthetic and rhythmic aspects of language, and it uses words in a manner which are beyond literal. Then we saw that how and why is 21st of March dedicated to this form which is poetry, and with that we established the centrality of poetry, that how it gives meaning, it gives a sense of I would say beauty to our otherwise maybe routine prosaic lives. We then saw the essential elements of the form of poetry and the three important genres or poetic genres, that is the dramatic poetry, epic poetry, and the lyric. Now we're going to further look at different poets, excerpts from their poems, and in particular discuss the different forms of the lyrics in the next segment of the lecture. Thank you.